Julius, it's great for you to be able to make it out here. I'm happy to share a stage with you, and we're not looking across a big pile of poker chips. The chairman of the FCC is a great poker player, and we're going to try to get him to break his poker face today.
No money will be lost here today.
Okay. So let me start by, just to get a kind of broad overview. I think a useful way to do that would be to talk about your experiences at the FCC, which actually go back a long way before your chairmanship. You worked with Reed Hundt at the commission back in the 90s, and that seems like a long time ago, and also like not that long ago, but the world has changed a lot. So talk about how the role of the FCC has changed between when you first walked in the door of that agency in 1992 or 1993 and today.
You know, it's interesting. The time that I was at the FCC in the 90s was actually the beginning of a period that we're in now. So I was there during the first auctions of spectrum for digital communications, the first discussion of digital TV and what ultimately became the transition from analog to digital, largely important because of how much spectrum that freed up for mobile broadband. It was the beginnings of the internet, and policies were adopted at that time that helped the internet grow and flourish. And I guess in a strange way, some of the issues that we're dealing with now really are kind of on they're exactly the issues we hoped we'd be dealing with when we worked on those policies 15 years ago. Some of the biggest issues we have today involve the opportunities of wireless, mobile internet, mobile broadband, and whether we have enough spectrum available to really seize the opportunities of that. We should come back and talk about that a little bit more. Yeah. But that's really sort of, in our wildest dreams, we thought that 12 years later, the country might have to deal with a problem like that, and now we do.
Do you think that the agency itself has a different mission now than it did because of the changes in the landscape?
Well, the main change in the mission has to do with the importance of the new communications infrastructure that everyone here knows is our core infrastructure for our economy and everything else going forward: high-speed internet, broadband, and I think something that I've realized is that we face as a country, and the FCC is in the middle of this, a kind of innovator's dilemma when it comes to these issues, promoting broadband, doing what we need to do strategically for our country for the 21st century. So what do I mean by that? Our success in the 20th century in a couple of important areas around communications are creating obstacles for us to do what we need to do in the 21st. So take over-the-air broadcast spectrum. You know, in the 20th century, there were policies that led to the commercialization of over-the-air broadcast TV, the creation of a big content industry, big contributions to our economy and beyond, a very good thing. Flash forward, people aren't watching TV anymore over the air. To the extent they're watching TV, they're watching it through cable and satellite. And of course, we have, internet video. And we know that because of the huge, fast, increasing demand on our spectrum for mobile broadband, we need to repurpose that spectrum for, to seize the opportunities for the years ahead. Our success in the 20th century make it harder to do that for various reasons. We have a plan on how to do that, which I'll come back to, but I'll give you one other example. The rollout of our copper voice telephone system in the 20th century was basically a big success. We connected people, we connected businesses, it fueled our economy, a very good thing. We know now that we need to move our wired infrastructure to much fatter pipes and different technologies. But the dependencies and reliances that grew up around the old system and technology are making it harder for us now to deal with these new disruptive technologies and do what we need to do for the 21st century, while other countries who we're competing with on this have a greater ability to just go to a whiteboard and say, hey, what do we want our digital infrastructure to look like for the 21st century?
So let me ask you a broad, before we drill down on specific areas of policy, which we will do, let me ask you a broad and somewhat confrontational question. I think there were a lot of people out here who were big fans of President Obama when he was a candidate. Part of the reason that they were fans of him was because he had announced a lot of policy positions that were broadly amenable to the entrepreneurial community, the technology community, et cetera. People who follow tech policy really carefully and communications policy carefully would say the following things, and there are a lot of really smart people at the FCC. They've been very deliberative. They have the right vision for where policy in these areas should go. But over the course of the past 22 months, not that much has gotten done. How do you respond to that? There's a sense of disappointment, I think, that things have not moved faster. How do you respond to that at the broadest level, but again, before we drill down on specific areas of policy?
Well, I don't think the facts support that. So one of the major initiatives has been to unleash spectrum. Right? We all know, listen to Mary Meeker, everyone here is involved in these issues. So, in the last year and a half since I've been there, we've done the first release of unlicensed spectrum, very high quality, 700 megahertz unlicensed spectrum in 25 years. A very big deal, new platform for innovation, ought to give us the next generation of Wi-Fi and more. We've taken other steps to free up spectrum for mobile broadband. We're deregulating spectrum that's been set aside for mobile satellite service to increase mobile broadband there. We've developed our incentive auction plan to free up a massive additional amount of spectrum. That's not done yet. We need Congress to act. We're going to be working on that very hard. We've taken a number of steps to lower the costs of broadband build-out so that we can get broadband build-out farther, faster. Now, this is, stuff like tower siting and pole attachment and rights of way, and I can tick through the things that we've done. It tends to be boring and geeky, but it's the blood and guts of actually making sure that, we can drive as much investment as fast as we can in building out our networks. We've, taken on reforming our $8 billion a year universal service fund. Still have a lot of work to do. So I keep going. But basically, I think we've gotten a lot done, and I think we have a lot more to do, and we will for a long time, because this is an important, as important a set of global competitiveness issues that the United States faces as anything else.
Let me just ask one other kind of overarching question, which actually goes to one of the things you just mentioned in there in terms of congressional action. So a couple weeks ago, we had a relatively big change in our political environment when the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives and increased their margin in the Senate. How does that change the landscape for you? Does that make things easier, harder, or not, or have not that great a change at all?
It shouldn't change, and I hope it doesn't change, because the kinds of issues we're working on shouldn't be partisan. Global competitiveness. That's a big
shouldn't be.
Look, the kinds of ideas that we're pursuing and that we want to work with Congress on, an incentive auction that will bring market forces to broadcast television allocation so we can free up spectrum for mobile broadband. Oh, and by the way, raise billions of dollars for the Treasury. We ought to be able to work together to get that done. Transforming an $8 billion a year universal service fund that's still a telephone fund and having that support broadband is something we ought to be able to work together on, and get done. So we're going to keep doing what we have been doing, trying to identify what are the levers to drive global competitiveness in the U.S. around broadband infrastructure and try to get it done.
Well, let's talk about broadband then. Not very many people, I'm sure, people here are familiar with the fact that you guys have placed a lot of emphasis on broadband deployment. Talk about your vision for that, and talk about what you think are the biggest impediments to getting done what you would like to see done in the course of your tenure. It might only be 2 more years. What are the biggest challenges that you face in terms of rolling out broadband at the pace that you hope to?
Well, we're not where we should be as a country when it comes to broadband. Many people here have traveled to other parts of the world. You know this to be true. So in terms of deployment, of broadband, there's still about 24 million Americans who just have no access to broadband at all. In terms of broadband adoption, people who subscribe, our adoption rate in the US is 65%, which compares to, say, 90% for Singapore. The kind of thing that keeps me up at night is a study that I think says it all. So there was a study that was done looking at 40 industrial countries, measuring them, including the US, on a small number of metrics going to competitiveness and innovative capacity. That's what it measured, and a couple of the important metrics in that survey were broadband deployment, adoption, et cetera. The study ranked the US 6th out of 40, which is an interesting Rorschach test because, you look around the audience, some people are saying, oh, 6th, it's better than I thought. Maybe things aren't so bad. It's better than, the 18th that I heard from this study or that study. And 6 is terrible. It's not good enough for the US. It's not good enough for the 21st century, but it's also not the most important thing about the study. The study then went on to look at those same metrics and look at rate of change. All the countries were improving, so rate of improvement. How fast was each country improving on all of these metrics, including broadband? And that way, the study ranked the US 40th out of 40. So that's, what scares me. And then you read all of, you read about a company like Applied Materials, a Silicon Valley company not far from here, very important focus on energy technology, decided a few months ago to move its CTO and its CTO's operations to Beijing. So the question that I think we all have to ask ourselves is how many companies have to move their CTOs overseas before we say we have a crisis?
But what's in the way of fixing it is my question. What are the obstacles to getting this done?
So the biggest obstacle, so here, it's the stuff we've been talking about, spectrum. We actually have a chance to lead the world in mobile broadband. We are going to be one of the very first countries in the world to roll out 4G. It's because we did our digital television transition relatively early compared to other countries. We obviously have incredible innovation going on now in the mobile space. That's the good news. The bad news is we know exactly the wall that we're going to run into if we don't do something about it, right? As people go to smartphones and tablets, the devices put demands on spectrum that's not just a little bit more than the previous improvements in phones, but that's 30x, 40x, 50 times more. Meanwhile, the amount of spectrum we have available for mobile broadband is a threefold increase. So we have this huge gap that we have to tackle. That's a very large impediment. A second is the Universal Service Fund, which I mentioned. It's a program that spends several $1 billion a year to support universal telephone service. It's done a perfectly good job over the years universalizing telephone service, but obviously it needs to be transformed for broadband in a smart, fiscally responsible way. That's another big obstacle. And we have to tackle these rights-of-way issues. Again, boring issues, but it's too hard and too expensive for companies to build out broadband infrastructure in the United States. And we have to tackle things, as I mentioned, we've started doing this, like tower siting, pole attachments. Here's an idea that we have to get done. This is something Congress has to get done. It's called dig once. If anywhere in the country someone is digging up a road, they ought to lay fiber at the same time. That hasn't happened yet in our transportation spending to say, well, we ought to just do this, make this policy, and get it done.
So I want to shift to an issue that's of great concern to this community, which is net neutrality. The president, as a candidate, was very strong on this issue. He appointed you, sent you to the FCC with 3 votes, which is what is required to implement a policy of the FCC. And yet we are now 23 months into his administration, and we have no policy. We have a proposal, a way of thinking about this, a third way that you've put forward, but again, no policy, no rule, which is, I think, for many people one of the greatest causes of concern about and what fuels the sense that things are not getting done that quickly at the commission. So talk about net neutrality, how that issue is going to get resolved, and why it has not been resolved yet.
Absolutely. Look, preserving the openness of the internet is just obviously important, right? For our global competitiveness, to make sure that this platform stays open to innovators, where it's the market and consumers picking winners and losers, not people who control access to the internet. We were on a course to adopt smart, sensible rules when we got a frustrating and seriously incorrect decision from the courts that complicated what we have to do. So we're dealing with that. We have terrific, smart lawyers trying to figure out the best way, the best basis on which we can wrest rules. Number one, that'll happen. The other thing is, we've been doing a lot of work to make sure that we get the rules right. We need to make sure that what we do maximizes innovation and investment throughout the ecosystem. I think especially over the last few months, by virtue of the process that we've been running, by virtue of more and more people coming together and say, well, actually, let's take on this challenge and see if we can figure out exactly what the rules are to write down. We're getting much closer to a perspective on these rules will maximize innovation and investment in a area that's fast-moving in terms of technology, fast-moving in terms of business models, and where we want to make sure that what we do actually is a spur to investment and innovation and doesn't, inadvertently slow things down.
Right. But there are people who say, that the court case, that Comcast case, right? Yeah. That they ruled that some of the authority that the commission had used before to regulate a lot of to do a lot of its regulatory work was not legitimate. There are many people who say that even without that basis, that you guys have plenty of basis to implement net neutrality rules. So are your smart team of lawyers, do you just reject the notion that you currently couldn't I believe it's under Title I, just simply do what you want to do?
Well, listen, the last two people who should be talking about statutory interpretation are you and me. But the bottom line is that our lawyers are looking.
Julius, you're a lawyer. You can talk about.
I am so happy that I'm not doing law full time anymore. In part because of issues like this. But all the options are still on the table. We're evaluating all of them. Our lawyers have been doing a lot of hard and great work. At the same time that, on a policy basis, we've been trying to look at what are the right rules to write down to preserve internet freedom and openness.
So when Google and Verizon started trying to negotiate this on their own as a private solution, was that helpful or harmful to the process?
Well, the idea that different players in the debate come together who had historically been on opposite sides to say, hey, can we agree on policy, that's a good thing. And some of the ideas that were in the Google-Verizon proposal reflect the progress that's been made on this issue in establishing basic norms of openness and freedom on the internet. I would have preferred if they didn't do exactly what they did when they did, and I think that it had an effect of slowing down some other processes that could have led to a resolution. But there we are with that. But I think, if the question is, for an issue like this, is the right way to resolve it by having some government policy makers and lawyers, sit in a room and come up with the right answer, as opposed to engaging broadly with stakeholders and encouraging lots of discussions among people in the ecosystem to really wrestle with, what are the issues? I think it's definitely the latter.
So you guys have now opened up an investigation of Google on privacy grounds, right? Which I'm sure you're not going to want to talk about that much. Although if you would like to talk about that, we'd be eager to hear about it. But to the extent that it plays into the larger question, which is the FCC, how are you going to deal with online privacy? And there's a lot of calls for new rules in terms of how to regulate that. Talk about that question, very pressing question for a lot of consumers as well as a lot of technology companies. And again, if you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that's got you interested in Google, we'd be happy to hear that.
Well, I can't talk about specific investigations, so I won't. You know, at the FCC, our role extends to the providers of wired and wireless broadband services. And so, you know, if hypothetically a company is using spectrum in a way that violates longstanding privacy rules at the FCC, then that's something that would fall within our jurisdiction that we would have to look at. You know, for a long time, there have been basic privacy rules that have applied to telephone companies and cable companies to protect proprietary consumer information. We'll continue to enforce those. You know, that's our role in the privacy ecosystem.
Right. And do you think there's a real and urgent need for new regulations in that area?
Well, in the areas that we touch, you know, we're staying on top of it. We're monitoring it. If things come up, we'll deal with it. But obviously the big debate around privacy right now isn't so much the communications access providers, but online companies, right. And so it's not something that we're directly engaged in.
So NBC and Comcast, that merger continues apace, and I know you guys have been reviewing that for a while. And again, I know you're not going to say what the status of that review is. I think most people presume that it's going to get through. But I want to ask a question of kind of bigger principle, which is, you know, given where the markets, the media market, the technology market, the web, everything is today, what now are the conditions under which the FCC would clearly need to step in and disallow a media merger?
You're asking me about the transaction. I can't talk about a specific.
No, I'm talking hypothetically.
Look, we have an obligation to review transactions that come to us and make sure they're in the public interest. You know, in this transaction, it's an open process. A lot of people have raised issues that we're looking at one by one. I can't go beyond that and talk about the transaction, but it's obviously, you know, important to make sure that you know, landscapes remain competitive, innovation promoting, and that's what we're looking at as we review the transaction.
But I really am not asking. I'm not kind of joking about being hypothetical, but I'm also being serious. I mean, they're beyond saying, you know, we must look at all mergers and decide whether they're in the public interest. At this, you know, you have a pretty firm grasp of what the marketplace looks like now. I'm trying to figure out if there's a principled way to think about, you know, future mergers. Forget this one.
Yeah.
Other couplings of large, either media companies, media and telecommunications companies. What are the new rules of the road, the new principles that define what the public interest is in that context? You know,
one of the things that I inherited at the FCC didn't make sense to me is that the way the agency has historically dealt with merger reviews is, you know, in a black box kind of way, without a transparent analytical framework. Right. And so one of the things that we've been doing since I've been there is in each area of the market, we have an obligation to write competition reports and send them to Congress. And historically, they haven't been particularly useful documents that actually gave people a sense of how the FCC would analyze various competitive issues that come up. What we've been doing is step by step taking those competition reports, laying out analytical frameworks, laying out the kind of data that we think is relevant to analyzing a market. And this isn't something that gets done overnight, but over time, in a more transparent, engaged process with people on the outside who are interested in this, develop a greater sense of what the competitive issues really are based on actual facts and data. Over time, take the process from less of a black box to more of, you know, here are the issues that are raised in the context of a particular framework and particular data.
So let me ask you a concrete question. We're going to go to questions from the audience in a second, but this is not a pending matter for you, but it's obviously, I think, of great importance. You know, in the mobile market, which you've referenced a number of times, we saw slides yesterday that Mary Meeker put up that showed the incredible growth in the Apple OS in the iPhone and in Droid, and the fact that, you know, the market shares of a lot of other providers of platforms in that area are shrinking pretty rapidly and pretty quickly. It's not that hard to imagine a world in the next few years where those two platforms, i.e. Droid and Apple, are dominant. You know, you could imagine very quickly a duopoly kind of taking hold in that marketplace. Is that a cause for celebration or a cause for concern? Not some new regulation, but merely does that look like, you're all about promoting competition and innovation. Is that an environment that looks like one that is innovation and competition friendly, or one that raises a certain amount of concern on your part?
It's a good question, and the answer is I don't know yet. I will tell you that the degree of competition and innovation that we're seeing around mobile now is really extraordinary. I mean, just for any of us, turn the clock back 3 or 4 years, compare the world to where we are now, it's been an incredible thing, right? There's an apps economy now that just didn't exist before. So 250,000 apps at least, it's probably more than that now. Each of them, I sometimes try to think through where are jobs being created, where can they be created? So 250,000 apps, how many employees per app would you assume?
No idea.
I don't know, a couple,
yeah.
2, 3, 4, correcting, I don't know. Yeah. So that's literally hundreds of thousands of jobs that have been created by virtue of the innovation that's been happening in the mobile space. That's a good thing, and I think it's in everyone's interest for that pace of economic activity, job creation, competition to continue.
Okay, we're gonna go to questions from the audience now. If you guys could line up if anybody has a question for the chairman. I'm sure you're all hitting your Ask the Chairman app right now, your automatic question generator. Yes, sir.
Hey, John. Tim Wu was on NPR this morning talking about Google and Apple as actually forces of evil that were suppressing technologies actively, and even used the word payola as it related to the relationship between Verizon and Google. How do you think about that and the threat to the open web as these companies become very, very powerful?
Well, it'd be a good question for Tim, but as I said, the first, what we're focusing on are the gatekeepers in terms of communications access providers. That's where our jurisdiction has historically been. That's what we're focused on. We'll try to understand the rest of the framework, and frankly, being engaged with the kind of people who are here through our processes, others, is helpful. But I think for now we're watching this develop, and the first thing that we can and should do is make sure that the pipes that connect people at their homes at work remain open for innovators and for consumer choice.
So just to follow up on that, so when you look at, again, without naming, well, you may name specific companies if you wish, but when you think about, again, to get to this question related to what Tim Wu's concerned about, what is the biggest threat to competition and innovation that you see in your purview now?
Well, I think that there are, one of the biggest issues that we can solve to make sure that we preserve the basic openness of the pipes is open internet. We talked about that.
Right.
I think, look, I'm going to be cautious in answering this question in part because this is such a fast-moving environment where, I don't think we want government to say, in advance, hey, we know exactly where the danger points are in advance, that we have more of an ability to see the future than we actually do. I think what's important is for, whether it's us or other agencies of government that look out for competition, to stay engaged in these issues, to make sure that we're compiling the data, the facts, the analytical frameworks to analyze it, and to be prepared to take action if an anti-competitive situation develops that's hindering innovation and that's hindering consumer benefits.
Yes, sir.
Yes, a quick question. Digital infrastructure and communication infrastructure is extremely important for the competitiveness of this country. And I assume that you look outside the United States as well for what other countries are doing. Which policies are you seeing in other countries outside the US which you wish you could copy or adopt here to emulate and get higher on the rankings in the competitive environment in the world?
I had a hard time.
The question is, if you look around the world, other countries are adopting policies to help their communications infrastructures. Which, if you had fiat and you could just pull a policy from some country around the world and implement it here without having to pass it through Congress or anything else, you could just do that. Which are the ones that you would use? That you would choose?
The countries that I'm most envious of in this respect are the ones that have a lot of wide open spectrum where they have the ability to say, oh, okay, so getting ready for the 21st century, here's a big block of spectrum that we're going to allocate through auctions for mobile broadband. Here's a big block of spectrum that we're going to put out for unlicensed spectrum as a platform for innovation, and not to have to struggle with some of what we have to struggle with because of our successes in the 20th century and the real facts that we have to deal with. But I worry about that a lot because I think the mobile internet is just going to be incredibly important here and to our global competitiveness. And it's going to be challenging for us to deal with existing allocations and uses and make the transition to what we want our spectrum strategy to look like.
You want to name a couple countries or no?
You know, the countries in Asia generally didn't develop the broadcasting industry that we did here, so they have much more flexibility with their spectrum because, so, you know, certainly in Asia you see a lot of focus on digital infrastructure in general. You know, the other thing I find myself occasionally envious of in other countries are the ones that have, just in this area, tremendous population density.
Yeah.
You know, if we had, you know, our population living in any one state, getting fiber to everyone would be a reasonably easy challenge. You know, getting fiber to everyone in the United States, given how large our country is a very serious challenge.
We should just clear out all of flyover country and push them all into the cities. That would be helpful. Massive population relocation would make your job easier. Yes, sir.
You know, as an investor and entrepreneur, obviously we're excited about the potential of ubiquitous mobile broadband. As a father and husband, I guess there's a little part of me that wonders a generation of kids that grow up with their wireless device surgically attached to them, whether there'll be any health and human safety issues around that. If you could just talk to how that fits into kind of policy and execution.
Sure, and the premise of how I answer it is the same as how you asked it. I have 3 kids, and you know, you worry just as a parent about a lot of things that you see around kids and how they interact with devices. You know, when should your kid get a mobile phone? When should your kid start being in the internet, and for how many hours a day? To what extent are the technologies, you know, somewhat addictive? How do you make sure your kids learn how to focus and concentrate? You know, it's not surprising, I think, that dramatic, disruptive technological changes give rise to a lot of hard questions around what new social norms should be. You know, one of the things that we want to do at the agency is be constructive and helpful in kind of gathering information that would be of use and assistance to parents in thinking about this. But there are, you know, there's no shortage of hard questions, and there's not a lot of good information out there, and you probably talk to your friends and have, you know, the same kinds of conversations.
Let me take this last question. Sorry, I just want to get into the guy behind you. I'm sorry, just because we're running really low on time. If you can just go, and Julius, try to keep this short.
Mr. Genachowski, Ryan Siegel from Wired.com. Quick question on municipal broadband and municipal fiber. I haven't heard much from the National Broadband Plan about ways to have cities, municipalities, communities, so forth, own the pipes, so that way you get past the problem of the pipe owners getting in the way of the public.
Well, it actually is a recommendation of the broadband plan, and we are talking to various municipalities who are looking at it. I think there are some examples of best practices where it's worked. I guess, all right, I'm supposed to answer quickly. The one thing I'll say is the release of unlicensed spectrum that we did recently, Super Wi-Fi, the white spaces spectrum, creates some new opportunities for local communities to provide broad, high-speed internet access on a cost model that's much better than the models they were looking at in the past.
Julius, thank you very much for the time today. It was very enlightening.
John, thanks. Congratulations on your book.